Hi, welcome to this Architecture in Practice session, or as I would like to call it, Architecture in Agile Reality. My name is Eltjo Poort. I work for CGI. I lead the architecture practice there. And most of my work consists of doing architecture work. I do a lot of second opinions and reviews of other people's architectures. And I also help many organizations to modernize their architecture way of working based on the material that we're going to discuss. This material I have also shared previously in, among other things, these three columns in IEEE Software Magazine. And I would like to encourage you to, after watching these videos, also have a look at these three articles, because they contain some more background information and some more details about the principles and practices that we're going to discuss. By the way, at the end of the presentation, there's a full list of literature citations. So, architecture in reality, if you talk to working architects right now, you will discover that most of them do their work in an agile context. And agile working has become the de facto standard, certainly in software development, but also in many other disciplines. And there has been quite a bit of tension between the communities that propagate agile working and the architecture community. And they started out, I guess, right away with the Agile, when the Agile Manifesto came out back around the millennium. And what we saw was that the architects were at the beginning quite skeptical about agile working. Because it looked like they were focusing mostly on producing functionality, the agile people, and did not pay much attention to several architecture aspects. And there are some principles, of course, in the Agile Manifesto, like we value working software over extensive documentation, where the extensive documentation by many was interpreted as what the architects do. And there's another principle that says that the best architectures emerge from self-organizing teams. And that sort of seemed to suggest that we don't need architects anymore. The teams can do the architecture, which in turn caused the architects to sort of be skeptical about this. You know, it's a real profession, architecture. So architects were worried about agile practice leading to accumulation of technical debt and short-lived solutions, and there certainly were many examples of those. And on the other hand, the agile community was looking for a scapegoat, somebody to represent the old way of working, or sometimes called the dark side. And the architects are a very easy target for that. They were accused of causing delays mostly, and of basically producing unnecessary documentation and stuff. And this tension is on the one hand understandable, but on the other, it doesn't need to be there. If you look at what architecture practices do and how agile practices work, there does not need to be a contradiction there. It's actually possible to get the best of both worlds, to combine architecture, do some upfront design, but maybe not as much as as some of us used to do in the past, and do some standardization, but also leave some freedom for the local teams to decide, and basically take care of the risk and cost control aspects of the software engineering process, and then combine that with agile practices, such as do some experiments rather than a lot of modeling and theoretical work, and that will teach you faster what is going to work and what is not, what is a good design and what is not. And many, or maybe even most, of the design decisions are best taken at the team level, because those are the people who are working with the material every day, and they have most of the information. So if it's possible at all, let the decisions be made there. And this is where you can find the balance. And I guess two very important principles for finding that balance and getting the best of the agile and the architecture practices is, first of all, to make sure that you have a short learning cycle. This is what architects need to learn from agile people. The shorter the learning cycle, the shorter the feedback loop with your stakeholders, the less delays you will cause, and the quicker you will get to a good design. And you know, there were architecture departments in many organizations who would sort of retreat for 2 or 3 months and design a solution that was then documented in a 200-page document. And that is not a fast learning curve. That is not a short feedback loop. That's a very long feedback loop. And we need to look at ways to make the architecture way of working more iterative and get to a shorter feedback loop. In the end, what really counts is the bottom bullet here under the balance here. Balance architecture and agile based on business rationale and not on dogma. So what we see is that some agile coaches and some traditional architects advocate a certain way of working because that's how they always learned it, right? And I think in all of these cases, if you need to choose, make a trade-off between architecture or agile practices in a certain situation, then always look at the business context and never sort of propagate a dogma like, you know, like a religious person or something like that. So how do you make architecture work in an agile context? Well, what we eventually found out was that the best way is to look at architecture not so much as a job description or a certain kind of output that you produce, but to look at architecture as a set of responsibilities. And this set of responsibilities are about the design that leads to a feasible and working solution. And we did some research into what these responsibilities then should be. And we came to these 5 that you see on this slide here. The first responsibility of the architecture function is to understand what's going on, understanding context. And Grady Butch, one of the gurus of software architecture, has created a very nice diagram with lots of colorful arrows that show the drivers out of the business and other contexts, that the forces that work on architectural design. Without context, without an understanding of the context, you cannot do architecture. You cannot make an architectural design or design a solution solely based on a number of documents, some documented requirements or something like that. Architecture doesn't work that way. You need to know what is behind those requirements. You need to know the question behind the question. You need to be able to ask why. And that is what the understanding context responsibility is about. And then the second responsibility is the red one here, is modeling. That is, of course, the most traditional responsibility associated with architecture. And it comes from the publications that we had in the 90s when people first started talking about architecture in the sense of IT systems and software development. When you build a model, you build an abstraction of the real world. And you use that abstraction to make decisions or to reason about the complexity, right? And the reason that we need these models, we need to abstract away from the code itself, is because our software has become so complex that if we have to take into account all the nitty-gritty details, that then it's too much. We cannot wrap our heads around that. We need to leave out some of the details, and that's why we model. Another responsibility is making decisions. It's about, I guess, 15 years ago, people started writing about software architecture as a set of design decisions. Grady Butch calls architecture the set of design decisions that that are significant, where significance is measured by the cost of change. So basically what he says is it's those decisions that are very hard to change later on. Those are the architectural decisions. Owen Woods says architecture is the decisions that if you make them wrong, will cause your project to fail. So you can look at architecture as a set of decisions. And then there is, of course, the responsibility of validating that your design is actually going to work. And that you can do that based on models or based on the real running solution or based on just thought experiments, but there always has to be some form of validation. That's one of the responsibilities. And then finally, there's a delivery responsibility that is part of architecture. And that does not mean that architects are responsible for the ultimate delivery of the solution. No, we have other people for that. That's what the teams are for, the delivery, the DevOps teams. But what it does mean is that there is a responsibility to support the delivery of the solution that you have designed. And if you don't do that, then you run the risk of well, a completely different solution being delivered than what you have designed. And that can be a good or a bad thing, depending on the context, of course. So that's what we came down to as to what architecture is about. It's about these 5 responsibilities. And the nice thing about these 5 responsibilities is that they give us a framework, you may call it, to reason about the maturity of organizations in fulfilling the architecture function. If an organization is good at fulfilling these 5 responsibilities, and not in isolation, but actually in a coherent way, then it can be mature, can have a mature architecture function and makes good designs, and it will successfully deliver the solutions. The nice thing about that is that you actually don't need an architect to fulfill an architecture function, as long as you fulfill these 5 responsibilities. What we started to see the last decade or so is that many organizations do not have a role called architect anymore, but they're still pretty damn good at doing architecture. And it turns out that they have found a different way of allocating these 5 responsibilities in their organization to teams, to maybe other roles like steward or master builder that have, you hear a lot of these words. And that's fine, as long as you make sure that these 5 responsibilities are taken seriously. You can divide them up however you want, as long as they keep talking to each other, of course. If you have Mary doing modeling, and you have Teresa doing the decision making, and Mary and Teresa don't talk to each other, obviously you still don't have a mature architecture function. So we built a maturity model and a maturity assessment sort of tool based on these 5 responsibilities. And we started to, a few years back, we started to go into organizations and talk to architects, but also talk to stakeholders of the architect, talk to agile teams, and also to more traditional project teams. And we started to ask them, how do you fulfill these responsibilities? And we sort of gave them grades. So we did a maturity assessment, in short. And after doing well, about a dozen of those, we started to see some quite striking patterns. The first pattern we started to see was the pattern in which the leftmost 3 responsibilities were taken seriously, but the team would sort of ignore the decision-making and the delivery responsibility. And their reasoning behind that was that the decision-making was not for architects, because architects, they considered themselves more like consultants, people that advise management, and then it's up to management to make the decisions. And the delivery of the solutions that they had designed, well, they would consider their work mostly done after delivering an architecture description document. Once it was approved, they would move on to the next project. So we started to call that pattern the waterfall wasteland. And its symbol is an ivory tower. You see here, this is not a mature architecture function. It's only doing part of the work. And if you don't fulfill the rightmost responsibilities, then that causes problems. We also started to see another anti-pattern, which we called the agile outback. And this is the anti-pattern where the teams would understand the context, then would start making decisions and immediately execute those decisions in delivery. These teams would not do modeling. They had various reasons not to do modeling, or let's say, maybe not reasons, but excuses. They would, for example, say, well, doesn't the Agile Manifesto say that the best architectures emerge from self-organizing teams? So maybe if we start modeling, we will disturb that sort of magical emergence process of the really good architecture. This is, of course, nonsense, because architectures, the best architectures may emerge from self-organizing team, but that's not a magical process. That is hard work. Emerging an architecture is a bit like dragging a crocodile out of a swamp. It's not like seeing a beautiful balloon just pop up out of a clear pool. It's a lot of hard work, and it has a lot of risks associated with it. And the other thing they would ignore is the validation responsibility. And the reason for that was that they said that it's better actually to learn from mistakes. You learn quicker from making mistakes than from doing a lot of thinking up front. And of course, there is some truth behind that in many circumstances. The line of text, the slogan that you would hear was fail early and fail often. But of course, there are many contexts in which failing early and failing often is not an option. It's, in very business critical or safety critical situations, failure is just too expensive or too dangerous. And this is, of course, where you have to make the trade-off based on the business context rather than on the dogma of fail early and fail often. So that would lead us to these 5 responsibilities, the anti-patterns. What we would like to see, of course, is organizations that fulfill these 5 responsibilities in a mature way. And the question that you then might ask, of course, is, well, how do you do that? Well, for that, we have these 4 principles. The principles of agile architecting, which we sort of figured out the hard way, I guess you could say, by doing a lot of architecture, by looking a lot at what teams are doing, by talking to a lot of architects and their stakeholders. And that will be the topic of the next video in this session.